Well, good morning. It's great to be with you all this morning, even though we are doing it this way. I have to admit, now I got to be honest with you. I am sending this message to three different churches, and when each of you contacted me, if I would come and speak, my hope was by this time that we would actually be able to do this in person. But apparently not, as the quarantine continues on. But at least we're able to get together this way. I have to admit, I'm here at the Owen Sound Alliance Church preaching to a camera because I can't sit down and preach to a computer screen. So thank you to Joel McCallum for setting this up for me and for us to be able to do this. But let's get into the Word this morning. You know, before the virus started, or what I'm referring to now as BV, before virus, one of my mentors and heroes of the faith, Dr. Arnold Cook, passed away. And so there was two funerals for him, well, two memorial services for him. One was down in Unionville, and one was in Owen Sound. And I decided I really wanted to go to both. So I drove to Unionville Alliance for the memorial service there, and it was wonderful. And I saw lots of people. We heard many great stories about Dr. Cook and his life and his ministry. And as I was driving back, I was going through all of these places that had been talked about by the other speakers, places where Dr. Cook had lived or had grown up. And as I drove through these places, I was hit with just this profound sense of legacy, of what Dr. Cook had done, of how he had led us as a denomination, of the lives that he had touched, and the legacy that he had left for me individually and for our denomination. The next day, there was a memorial service in Owen Sound, and it was fun to hear more of the family stories. But as they said the names of the families that they used to spend time with, I realized these were the same families that I used to spend time with when I lived just outside of Owen Sound. And again, the whole idea of legacy just came rushing back. Now, not long after that, this whole virus thing started. I remember just before it began, kind of back when we were still referring to it as the Wuhan flu, I was speaking at the Ottawa Chinese Alliance Church, and I told them there that I had actually been to Wuhan. And when I said that, a lady near the front actually got up and began to walk out of fear that I might have the virus. But then when I said it was over 2 years ago that I was in Wuhan, that if I had it, I had COVID-18, which apparently isn't as bad. But the virus has changed our lives, hasn't it? Life has stopped, really, in many ways. And when it will begin again and what life will look like when this is all over is still very much to be determined. Churches have increased their online presence, and that has been improving every week. And it's been neat to see the growth in that from all the churches, really, that are online. And but the idea, again, of legacy comes back. See, how we act and what we do now and when this is over is going to shape the legacy of ourselves personally and as church for a long, long time. Today, we're going to look at the story of Mary and Martha. Now, this story is very near and dear to me because about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, I contracted a Legionnaire's disease. I was in the hospital for many days, a long time to recuperate. And in fact, it wasn't until about 6 months ago that I really began to feel better and began to recover from that. It's been quite a health journey that I've been on, and many of you know about it. And that I'm still on. But it was during a prayer time that I was at just before I got sick. And a friend of mine and someone I trust very much came to me and said, "Bill, I have a word from the Lord for you." And when you hear that, sometimes, it depends on who it's coming from as to how much weight you're going to put on it. But this is a man I trust, I consider a friend. And so he said to me, he said, the Lord is saying to you, be more like Mary and not Martha. Be more like Mary and not Martha. So, of course, I dove right into the passage and tried to figure out, and I've come to a number of conclusions. But the latest conclusion I've come to, I'm going to be sharing with you today. Because you see, in this story, we see that in life, God gives us both challenges and opportunities. And how we respond to those will shape our legacy. In life, God gives us both challenges and opportunities, and how we respond to those will shape our legacy. I want to read from the Bible, Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, I'm going to start with verse 38. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. So the first point I want to make is that of hospitality. And you see, Jesus is traveling. He's traveling around. And that's what he would do at this time. Travel from town to town walking, because there's no car. There's no bus you can take. He wasn't flying places. Him and his disciples and their extended group, the crew, I will call from here on out, would basically walk from town to town. He would arrive at a town, and he would preach and teach during the day, and he would mentor the disciples and the others who were with them at night. Now, this is very different, of course, from a modern pastor today who is typically in one place, in one location, and has their flock, has their congregation. What Jesus was doing is more like the traveling pastors or evangelists that 20, 30 years ago used to travel around and to speak. Or when I think about it, actually it's a lot like a missionary when they come home on home assignment, traveling around and going to different places and to talk about what the Lord is doing. And usually the missionary or the traveling evangelist or whoever it is depends on the hospitality of the people who live where they're going in order to help to take care of them. One of my friends in Cambodia, Perom, does just that. He travels around. He works for Evangelism Explosion, and he will go to different countries and different places in Cambodia to train believers how to do evangelism. And he relies on the hospitality of the believers where he goes. He doesn't have a place to stay. He doesn't have food to eat. He goes there and is reliant on the people there to help to take care of him. In fact, usually he leaves on a trip without enough money to get back. And yet he is always able to return because the Lord is good and the Lord's people are good. So in this passage, Martha opens her home to Jesus and to his crew. Now, why? Why did she do that? Maybe she always did it. Maybe she enjoys doing it. You see, Jesus was not the only traveling teacher of his day. It was kind of what happened. Teachers would travel around. They go from town to town. They would teach. People would show them hospitality, and then they would move on to the next town. And so hospitality really consisted of an evening meal and a place to sleep. You know, hospitality has always been an important part of the church. And I remember that very vividly, seeing that in rural Saskatchewan when Alana and I lived there in 1995. I was there finishing doing some seminary studies, and we really didn't have any money. We were basically living from week to week, the typical starving student. And so then I discovered that churches were in search of pastors to come out and to preach. They're in search of pulpit supply. And there was a number of small churches in rural Saskatchewan that would invite me to come out and speak. And they're about an hour and a half away from where I was living in Regina. And so speaking consisted of teaching both Sunday school and preaching the morning worship service. Now, the only difference was they were both essentially sermons, but the Sunday school I taught from in the sanctuary from the aisle on the floor by the pews. And to preach, I went up to the pulpit. But I would go, I would speak. They would always have a very generous honorarium check to give me. And then we would be invited to their house, someone's house, for lunch. Now, if you're eating Sunday dinner in rural Saskatchewan, they are killing the fattened calf for you. And we would eat, and it was kind of like Thanksgiving every Sunday. And then before I would leave, they would go down into their cellar. And everybody who lives in rural Saskatchewan has about 3 months' worth of food in their cellar. And they would load up my trunk with groceries, and I would be able to head back to town with enough money and enough food to get through a couple of more weeks. The hospitality of the family of God. And that's what Martha was doing here. Helping others. You see, hospitality is more than an invitation to a meal. In fact, right now, we can't invite people over for a meal. Right now, hospitality might mean getting groceries for someone, or fixing their car, or even going by their window and waving and saying hello, or calling them, or video chatting with people. You see, right now, our world is in need of hospitality. People are scared, and people have a lot of time. And we have an opportunity as the church to be able to model for everyone else what hospitality looks like, and to be able to share that with those around us. So the question I have is, how are we doing? What is our legacy going to be in the area of hospitality when this is all over? We need to show hospitality, not to get more people in the church or to win souls, but because we care about people and we want to help them. Which leads me to my next point, study or stress. And so I'm going to read from the scriptures again. Luke chapter 10. This time I'm going to read verses 39 and 40. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." So first, we see that Mary studies. You see, Jesus begins to teach. Mary sees an opportunity to learn. And so she goes and she sits at his feet. She could have helped her sister, but there was a famous teacher in the house. How often do you get a famous teacher coming to your house and pretty much teaching for free? It's kind of like all these free online courses that are going on right now. She was hungry to learn, and there was an opportunity to learn, and so she took it. We went, my wife Alana and I, and at the time 1-year-old Holly, went to Cambodia in 1996. And when we went there, we began to work with Cambodian students. And Cambodian students then and still now are just hungry for knowledge. They would often study at 2 different bachelor's degrees at 2 different schools at the same time because they so much wanted to learn. And then the Christian students are so hungry to learn and then to share that with others. They will often go to their towns and to their churches, and they'll start English classes in their churches. Now, these are meant to be both meeting a need of the need for English, but also as a way of doing evangelism. But they're tapping into that hunger that exists within the Cambodian student community to learn. Now, are you hungry to learn these days? Or are you just hungry? I've heard someone say that there's 2 curves we need to flatten. There's the one they talk about where we want to get herd immunity and all that. And then there's this curve here that we need to work on. I have to admit that sometimes I'm not necessarily hungry to learn these days. I'm just simply hungry. But Mary saw an opportunity to learn, and she took it. But what about Martha? Poor Martha. Martha stresses. You see, Martha is distracted. She is so busy making preparations for her guests that she misses the opportunity to study. Now, at this point in life, she does not know that Jesus is God. But she does know that she's got a very famous teacher in her house with the opportunity to study. But I got to admit, when I first read, as I've said, I've read this story a number of times, and I've come to the conclusion that Martha gets a bad rap. You see, we need Marthas. We need people who do the things that Martha did. We also need people named Martha, but we need people who will clean the church, who will decorate, who will set tables up, who will do all of those behind-the-scenes kinds of things that for those of us who just show up when it's time for the event, it's already there and it's all ready to go. Without Marthas, none of this would ever happen. And it would, you'd show up for an event, nothing be set up, and it'd be a little bit chaotic. Martha has a gift, and she enjoys doing what she does. And other people, and we all know them, have those gifts as well and enjoy doing those kinds of things that Martha was doing. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem Martha has in this passage is that she started to complain about her sister. See, she wanted her sister to be like her. She wanted her sister to have the same gifts that she had. So, are you a Mary or are you a Martha? Mary studies with Jesus. Martha prepares. Each are exercising the gifts that God has given to them. As I said already, the problem with Martha was that she complained. She wants Mary to be like her. Martha is not valuing Mary and the gifts that she has. Early in our ministry in Cambodia, when I first arrived in Cambodia, I had these visions of being this guy who traveled around, well, kind of like Jesus in this story, traveled around from village to village and preached, and many people would come to know the Lord, and I'd have these guys that would travel around with me. This was kind of my vision of what I was going to do in Cambodia. Problem was, when I began to study language, I realized that I really wasn't all that good at speaking Cambodian, which is kind of a prerequisite for doing that kind of ministry. In fact, I made a lot of language mistakes. There was a time when I wanted to tell people I enjoy fixing my car. But what I in fact told them was that I was having an affair with my mechanic. So you can imagine how that went over. But what happened was, as I realized I wasn't going to be able to travel around, as I realized that I was going to struggle with language, I went to a service in a small church once, and I was preaching there. And I'm preaching away, and there's two old ladies sitting in the front row. And one of them turns loudly to the other and says, "I have no idea what he's saying." And the other one says, "I don't either." At which point, my 3-point sermon became a 1-point sermon. I kind of wrapped it up, and I went home. But I realized that I have gifts that I can use for things such as English teaching. And I was able to match those gifts up with the ministry that God's given to me. Which leads me to the third point, and that is the best choice. So, again, from Luke chapter 10, verses 41 and 42. "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." So we see that Jesus reprimands Martha. He starts out by saying, "Martha, Martha." Now, it is never a good sign when someone starts their statement to you by repeating your name twice. Actually, it's a two-syllable name. My name is a one-syllable name, so I often get it 3 times. Bill, Bill, Bill. You know, it might be a teacher, it might be a parent. It's never a good sign. You know what's coming after your name said once, twice, or 3 times is going to be some form of reprimand. And so Jesus says, you're worried about many things. Worry. You know, sometimes it's hard not to worry. Sometimes our worries come from life, like right now. You know, there's many of us who are worried about the future, worried about when this is going to end, worried about, you know, some people might be worried about their income and how they're going to make ends meet during this time. But there's really 2 kinds of worry. There's a worry that comes from life, as I've said, but there's also a worry that is an illness. Maybe it's a chemical imbalance, maybe, or whatever it might be that leads to anxiety. You see, during this health journey that I've been on, one of the things that came out of it was anxiety. I've never been anxious before in my life, but now, for really no identifiable reason, I would be anxious. So anxious that I couldn't work, I couldn't think. 9 months ago, I would not be able to stand up here and be able to preach to a camera or to people or anyone because the anxiety was that crippling. Well-meaning people would come to me and would quote scriptures about what the Lord said about not worrying and the Lord is going to take care of you. I know these truths, but I couldn't stop worrying because it was a physical, a mental illness that required some real concrete steps to be able to overcome. The thing I came to realize is you can't reason with illness. You can't talk a person out of a cold. But I think sometimes we try to do that with anxiety. But in this situation, Martha is worried because she's too busy. And Jesus helps her to see things straight. He says to her, Mary has chosen well. Now, this doesn't mean that Martha did not choose well, at least at first. You see, Mary chose what fit best with her personality, her gifts, her desires, what she saw her calling to be. To study, to learn, to maybe teach and share that with others. That's what Mary was doing. And Martha, in the beginning, is exercising her gifts of hospitality. But she begins to feel jealous. She feels hard done by. And you see, it's human nature for us to think that we are getting the short end of the stick and to be jealous of others when they seem to be getting something that maybe we're not able to get. Which brings me to the question, what are you choosing? Or maybe the better question is, are you choosing well? Are you choosing what is best for you? See, when this isolation first started, many of us, me included, had great plans of, completing studies or reading, 20 books or doing all this kind of self-help, self-development kind of stuff. And now we're kind of at the point that if you get out of bed and you put on some pants, then you're having a good day. Some are accomplishing the things they set out to do, and some are not. But it's important to know yourself. It's important to know what your gifts are, what your abilities are, what your goals are, what your desires are. And if you get fulfillment out of studying, out of reading 20 books, then you should do that. If you get fulfillment out of having the best garden on the block this year because you got lots of time to work on it, you should do that. But we need to look at ourselves and we need to understand what our calling is and how we can be better preparing ourselves to fulfill that calling. Not just when this is over, but even right now. So I said before, I had trouble with language study. I didn't really, I didn't enjoy it because I wasn't a book learner. And so what I realized I needed to do was I needed to go out into my neighborhood and I needed to practice my Cambodian with native speakers. And I would get one or two lines and a question, and I would go out and I'd talk to my neighbors, and then they'd talk back to me and I'd have no idea what they were saying. So I'd go to some others, and then the next week I'd get a few more lines, and that's how I learned. Because first I tried to do the book learning thing, and it wasn't working. I needed to know myself, and I needed to know how I worked, and I needed to know the gifts that God had given to me. So, in conclusion, God allows us to go through things, to make choices, as we've seen in today's story. Sometimes we choose well, and sometimes not as well. Mary chose well, not because it is better to study than to cook, but because it fit her calling and her gifts. I want to tell you about a friend of mine. His name is Cian. And Cian came to our student dorm in city of Phnom Penh. We used to run a dorm for university students. And Cian was studying at the university. He came and stayed at our dorm. Later on, he became the leader of the dorm. And I was mentoring him, and I was teaching him how to preach and how to teach. And he was really struggling. And so I sat in on a few of his lessons and a few of his sermons, and I began to realize that what he was doing was he was trying to preach and teach like me. But he's not me. And so I sat him down and I said, you need to allow your personality to shine through. You need to allow God to use your gifts, not try to mimic someone else's. And after that, he blossomed, and he's had a great ministry. See, we each have been given gifts, passions, life experiences, and examples that lead us to what we have been called to do. Personally and corporately, our calling doesn't change during this pandemic. But how we carry it out, how we fulfill our calling, will. It brings new opportunities and a lot of changes. And it is easy to get busy with things that we're really not called to do. See, as an organization and as individuals, we need to remember what we're called to do. We need to remember the legacy that Dr. Arnold Cook laid out for us of world evangelization. We need to take these new opportunities that come through this pandemic, and we need to lean into them. But our calling remains the same, individually and corporately. We need to remember our legacy as we all together shape a new one.